Russia invaded Ukraine, bringing conflict to Europe on a scale that hadn't been seen since the Second World War. At the time, most, if not all, political commentators believed victory for Russia would be swift and decisive, with the only real question being just how far Putin would go before he was satisfied. The reasoning behind those bold predictions was pretty simple. In the red corner was Russia, one of the largest and most feared military forces on the planet, led by seasoned campaigner and notorious topless horseback rider Vladimir Putin. Whilst in the blue and yellow corner was Ukraine, outnumbered and outgunned in every conceivable department, and led by a former comedian, Volodymyr Zelensky. But as the weeks and months dragged on, it became abundantly clear that victory for Russia was nowhere near. And that got me thinking, if one of the world's most powerful countries could be thwarted by a far smaller foe today, what the f*** happened in World War II? Think about it. In only a few months between the end of 1939 and 1940, Nazi Germany somehow conquered half of Europe and a good chunk of North Africa, growing so powerful that it took the combined efforts of Britain, the Soviet Union, the USA, and a whole host of other countries to finally bring them down. When viewed alongside the war in Ukraine, that kind of freewheeling military domination just doesn't make any sense. Also, consider that Hitler's assault on world freedom came just 20 years after Germany suffered crushing defeat in World War I, and the whole situation is downright baffling. So, how did the Nazis snowball so suddenly, and why was the rest of Europe so utterly powerless to stop Hitler's war machine in its first few years? I'm glad you asked. If we go back to just after the First World War, Germany posed about as much threat to world peace as a damp flannel. Under the Treaty of Versailles, signed by the newly installed Weimar government as part of the German surrender, Germany reduced its military to 100,000 individuals and disbanded its air force altogether. After some vigorous political arm twisting and the odd persuasive nipple cripple thrown in for good measure, Germany also accepted full responsibility for the war and agreed to pay billions of dollars in reparations to the rest of Europe. That was all very good in principle, but in practice, Germany was practically penniless. And so the Weimar government came up with a genius economic plan to pay off its mounting debts. It started printing money by the truckload. Yeah, you don't need to have an economics degree to see where this one's going. All that shiny new money flooded the German economy, triggering mass hyperinflation that, at its worst, saw 4.2 trillion German marks being worth a single US dollar. If you were unfortunate enough to be a German citizen in the early 1920s, you didn't keep your money in a wallet. You needed a wheelbarrow. Like, literally, people actually did that. By 1924, the German economy was on the floor. Industrial output was at an all-time low, and widespread food shortages left millions on the point of starvation. But just when the fields were fully fallow, help came from an unlikely fellow, the United States, a country with which Germany had been at war just 6 years before. Under what became known as the Dawes Plan, Germany borrowed huge sums of money from American banks to fund a booming cultural and economic recovery in the mid to late 1920s. Now, running your country on foreign credit might sound a bit risky, but the Weimar government wasn't worried. They were borrowing from America, the wealthiest, most stable country in the world. What could possibly go wrong? As it happens, that question had a three-word answer: the Great Depression. That little clusterfuck hit the US markets in the summer of 1929, and Germany suddenly found that those lovely American bankers who'd been giving them so much money over the previous 5 years were no longer picking up the phone. So, to sum it all up, by 1930, Germany was basically broke, bereft of allies, and barely the army to battle a beehive. And yet, fewer than 10 years later, they would kick off World War II, having somehow transformed themselves into a world superpower with the most feared army in all of Europe. When you say it like that, Such a transformation sounds literally impossible. There simply wasn't enough time, and granted, that's completely true. But it turns out the first seeds of recovery had been planted more than a decade before the Great Depression even began. You see, ever since the Treaty of Versailles, way back in 1919, Germany had been secretly rebuilding its military capabilities. Under the Weimar government, the German police force was quietly given training and equipment of a distinctly military nature. Paramilitary groups were allowed to grow unhindered into what soon became small private armies, and money was discreetly funneled into the research of forbidden military technologies. At the same time, state-sponsored clubs started popping up all over the country. Publicly, they were perfectly innocent. Sports teams, youth programs, aviation clubs, that sort of thing. But privately, they were little more than military training camps in which potential leaders were being picked and future Luftwaffe pilots were primed. An entire generation of Germans was being readied for war behind closed doors. As per the Treaty of Versailles, this was all totally illegal. So these efforts had to be hidden from the international community, and that did impose a kind of natural limit on German rearmament. But the arrival of the Great Depression dealt fiscal death to the Weimar Republic, and it's safe to say that the bloke who took their place didn't overly concern himself with the opinions of Europe. You might have heard of him actually. He went by Adolf, and when he consolidated power in Germany in 1933, he was well and truly tired of the Treaty of Versailles. In fact, he planned to tear that document into neat little squares so he could wipe his arse with it. During the mid to late 1930s, Hitler kicked off the biggest industrial expansion in Germany's history as he tuned the economy in its entirety towards a single end: war. Every man, woman and child with a functional body was put to work for the greater good. Many were funneled into factories producing munitions and vehicles of war. Some furrowed the fields, and others built massive public projects, including the now famous autobahns. Hitler paid for all of this with what amounted to little more than financial smoke and mirrors, involving shell companies and shady promissory notes known as Mifo-bills. The whole thing was entirely illegal and hopelessly unsustainable. But Hitler wasn't interested in Germany's long-term financial stability. No. He was going to war, and so long as he won, he'd be able to pay off Germany's mounting debts with all of that loot. In other words, he was turning Germany into the biggest bully in the playground, and he was about to go after the rest of Europe's lunch money. By 1935, Germany's army had tripled to 300,000 men, and its air force, something that's very existence was outlawed, boasted 2,500 cutting-edge warplanes. Now, Hitler wasn't exactly known for his modesty. This is a man who believed his people were part of a master race that deserved to rule over mankind. And so he simply couldn't resist showing off his shiny new army to the rest of the world at what he dubbed the Freedom to Rearm Rally. Publicly admitting to breaking the treaty was a risky move, but Hitler had come up with a nifty little excuse. He claimed he was rearming as a purely defensive measure, and that by doing so he wasn't threatening European peace, but actually helping to maintain it. That might sound ridiculous, but what happened next was downright insane. People actually believed him. Looking back with the benefit of hindsight, it's hard to say exactly why that was. Perhaps Europe's other political leaders simply underestimated just how dangerous Germany was becoming under Hitler. Or maybe they were too wary of rocking the boat for fear of plunging the world back into war. But no, Hitler put on a literal f***ing military parade to shout about his giant illegal army, and the rest of the world simply rolled over, which only served to make the man with the tiny mustache even bolder. By 1939, on the cusp of the biggest war in history, all those years of fevered preparation had borne lethal and abundant fruit. Hitler's army contained more than 4 million soldiers, and his power was absolute. But That alone doesn't entirely explain why Germany was such a juggernaut in the first 2 years of the war. Hitler may have commanded a stronger army than any of his enemies in a one-to-one comparison, but World War II wasn't a singles match. It wasn't even a tag team. It was a Royal Rumble involving more than 50 countries, and the combined forces of the Allies far outnumbered those of the Axis powers from day one. Well, actually, day two. When Hitler fired the World War II starting pistol by invading Poland, it took Britain and France 2 days to decide that might be a problem and declare war. So, just 54 hours into a war that would last 6 years, the Nazis were vastly outnumbered by the combined forces of the Allies, which also happened to have more money, more resources, more ships and planes, more pastries, more pretty much everything. And yet, we've all read the history books. During the early part of the war, this apparent underdog tore through Europe like a genetically enhanced pit bull. In just 19 months, Hitler successfully invaded Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, France, Yugoslavia, and Greece, with the Allies powerless to stop him. As for how he did it, well, it turns out Hitler had a trick up his well-starched sleeve. Just 21 years separated the end of the First World War and the start of the Second. But during that time, warfare had changed forever. The trouble was, only the Germans had actually noticed. World War I was fought largely in the trenches, with long periods of stalemate as huge forces dug in behind fixed lines. Attacking such heavily defended positions was certainly possible, but it cost the aggressor dearly. However, in World War version 2.0, fortified trenches received a huge nerf. Thanks to advances in tanks, planes, and other newfangled weaponry, trenches had become defenseless. German tactics heavily hinged on these hulking machines, using their speed to surprise enemies with a torrent of tanks and motorized infantry. The objective was to daze the enemy and decimate their defenses. This rapid shitstorm on the ground was simultaneously supported in the skies by newly designed dive bombers that focused their efforts where enemy resistance was strongest, whilst also harassing support lines. You probably know this approach to murdering the enemy as the famous Nazi blitzkrieg tactics, a word that literally translates to lightning war. But oddly enough, the term blitzkrieg was never actually used by the Germans. The term was picked up by Western media and somehow stuck. Anyway, in reality, and contrary to popular belief, the foundational principles of blitzkrieg, strike fast and strike hard with combined arms, weren't anything new. The Germans simply combined classic military ideas with modern technology in ways that nobody had ever seen before. The final piece in this devastating blitzkrieg puzzle was to humble radio. Much like tanks, radios were readily used in the First World War, but they were large and unreliable, and their pitiful range made them about as viable as shouting really loudly. But in World War II, radios were much smaller, with much better range. And so you don't need to be Sun Tzu to know that effective communication is an incredible asset on the battlefield. And the Germans were quick to adopt the radio as a means to coordinate their devastating blitzkrieg attacks. Of course, the Allies had access to all these tools too, they just hadn't had the time to figure out how to use them as effectively. At the start of the war, the British didn't have a single dedicated armoured division in their entire army. The Poles were still heavily reliant on cavalry, and whilst the French actually had more tanks than the Nazis, they didn't arrange them in mass ranks like in the German panzer divisions, but sprinkled them here and there amongst the infantry. Most French tanks also lacked radios, meaning they simply had no way to match the seamless coordination of Hitler's ranks. The tactics we now call blitzkrieg were so effective that they allowed the Nazis to defeat their enemies incredibly quickly, and often with minimal losses. France fell to the Nazi war machine in 6 weeks. Poland, 35 days, and Denmark in just 6 hours. Sorry, Denmark. Okay, so there's been a lot of background to cover in this video, but if I had to sum it all up in a too long didn't watch, it would be something like this. The Nazis were so unbelievably successful in the first 2 years of the Second World War because they were better prepared than everyone else. That extra prep time allowed Hitler and his generals to amass a huge, well-equipped army, gain a technological edge over their enemies, and master the nuances of mechanized warfare before anyone else. You have to remember, for years Hitler knew he was preparing for war, whilst his neighbours were preparing for peace. This crucial head start proved too powerful for Europe to overcome, and if Hitler hadn't begun to believe his own propaganda, namely that his army was all but invincible, the Allies might never have caught up. But, as it transpired, by the middle of the war Hitler was no longer a schoolboy looking to steal some lunch money. He more resembled a crazy homeless person wandering the streets with piss in his shoes, trying to start fights with absolutely everyone. In the summer of 1941, Hitler ordered the invasion of the Soviet Union as part of Operation Barbarossa. And 6 months later, he declared war on the United States in the aftermath of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Strong though it was, Nazi Germany didn't have the manpower nor the resources to win a truly global war, and yet that's what Hitler ultimately got himself into. It took some time, but eventually, the stronger, larger economies of the Allies started to outproduce those of the Axis powers. Allied defeats became the exception rather than the rule. And thanks to the bravery and sacrifice of countless people from many different countries, one of the darkest periods